Hi, everybody. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Thank you so much for tuning in to our 58th consecutive week of America at a Crossroads programming. Tonight, we welcome the Dean of UC Berkeley School of Law, Erwin Chemerinsky, and Filibuster scholar, Richard Arenberg, in conversation with Henry Weinstein of UC Irvine School of Law on the topic of the filibuster. For those of you who are newcomers to this weekly America at a Crossroads series, we are a joint project of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. And our leadership team members are Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lair, and myself. Thank you to our many wonderful co-sponsors. Their names were all posted before the program began. A special welcome tonight to a special co-sponsor, the A. Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. Before I introduce our first set of speakers, a couple of housekeeping matters. I just wanted to let everybody know that if you unsubscribe to our emails, you will not get our emails. And that means you will not get a timely Zoom link in time for you to get into our programs. The only other Zoom link you will get is from Eventbrite. Eventbrite sends out an email right before our program, but it is very often delayed for reasons that we don't understand and over which we have no control. And I know each week I get a couple hundred frantic or sometimes angry emails from audience members telling me they don't get the Zoom links or they come late. So if you have unsubscribed advertently or inadvertently and you want to resubscribe so that you can get timely notices, just email me and I will help you resubscribe. If not, don't be mad at me. I can't control Eventbrite's email systems. And two more things, if you don't have the Zoom link an hour before the program starts, just email me and I'll send it to you. And it helps if you register to our programs early, before the day of. If you register in the hour before the program starts, the only way you'll get the Zoom link is by me personally sending you an email. And I end up sending around 200 Zoom link emails in the 30 minutes before each program. And we are completely volunteer driven, have no administrative assistance. So I just wanted to make these housekeeping matters clear to all of you so you understand what our systems are and their limitations. Also, please remember that next week's program with Congressman Kinzinger is on Thursday, not Wednesday, at 5 p.m. Pacific time. We have lots of great programs coming up, so to be sure to register early. We've added a program with the former chair of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, and a July program we just added today with Congressman Jamie Raskin and election law scholar, also from UC Irvine, Rick Hassan. And of course, you don't want to miss a very timely program with Deborah Lipstadt, who's an anti-Semitism and Holocaust scholar, speaking with Rabbi Ed Feinstein 2 weeks from tonight to discuss the frightening rise in anti-Semitism. Now, to introduce tonight's program. Erwin Chemerinsky is Dean of Berkeley Law. Previously, he was a founding dean of UC Irvine School of Law. He has taught law and political science at Duke, USC, UCLA, and more. He has written 11 books, including leading case books and treatises about constitutional law, criminal procedure, and federal jurisdiction. Dean Chemerinsky is a graduate of Northwestern University and Harvard Law School and has been named the most influential person in legal education in the United States. We're very happy to have you with us tonight, Professor. I'd also like to introduce you to Professor Richard Arenberg. Richard Arenberg is interim director of the A. Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University, where he teaches the practice of political science. He is also a senior fellow in international and public affairs at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown. He is an award-winning author, and he is co-author of Defending the Filibuster, which was named Book of the Year in Political Science. Professor Arenberg is a veteran of more than 34 years on Capitol Hill in senior staff positions with Senators George Mitchell, Carl Levin, and Paul Tsongas. Very happy to have you with us also, Professor Arenberg. And Professor Henry Weinstein. Professor Weinstein teaches lawyering skills and media law at UC Irvine School of Law. He has worked as a legal reporter for Los Angeles Times for many years. He also worked for the New York Times, San Francisco Examiner, and Wall Street Journal, all in the context of legal reporting. He's written more than 3,000 stories reporting on the ground in 36 states, plus the District of Columbia and Canada. Henry Weinstein received his BA in history and his law degree, both from UC Berkeley. Now, to introduce the second part of tonight's program, please welcome my friend, colleague, and partner in this enterprise, David Lair.
Thank you, Janice. I'm pleased to join you and welcoming everyone to America at a Crossroads. Tonight is our second doubleheader program, including an add-on discussion responding to events that compel examination. Complementing the scheduled discussion, we'll discuss events in the Middle East with Dennis Ross, the man who has done more critical negotiation with the parties in the region than anyone, with the possible exception of Henry Kissinger. Over the past several weeks, his op-eds have appeared in the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. He's among the most often quoted mavens when reporters are looking for expertise on the conflict. There simply is no one better to offer perspective on what current events mean than Dennis. We're extremely fortunate to have him back, and he'll be interviewed by one of our most frequent hosts, KPCC's Larry Mantle. Larry can discuss movies, sports, political philosophy, and current events with equal facility. He's the recipient of numerous honors, including Journalist of the Year awarded to him by his peers. We're pleased he's able to join us on such short notice. Ambassador Ross and Larry's 30-minute dialogue will start in 1 hour from now at the conclusion of the filibuster discussion. Now here's my good friend Henry Weinstein. He will moderate Filibuster, Relic, or Guardrail. Henry?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Janice, and thank everyone in the audience for joining us this evening for this important subject. I suspect for many people of roughly my age, that their introduction to the filibuster may have been in the famous 1939 movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which has been referred to both in writings of Professor Arenberg and Professor Chemerinsky. For those of you that have not had the pleasure of seeing it, he's a freshman congressman, and he's fighting off some people who are trying to defeat his campaign for a national boys camp. He campaigns for 23 hours, and the idea is that a lone senator, an underdog equipped only with an apple and a case of tea, can achieve great results. Now, his 23 hours, as some of you may also remember, was exceeded in 1957 by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who staged what is the record longest filibuster in an effort to defeat a civil rights bill. I hasten to add that although Thurmond was on the floor for 24 hours with the aid of Barry Goldwater intervening for about 10 minutes, Thurmond got a brief bathroom break, but he did manage to last for 24 hours. It's also, I should say, that it's not just historically, not just, right-wingers like Strom Thurmond, who used the filibuster as a weapon, also crusading Senator Robert La Follette during the First World War, and much later, Wayne Morris, arch-liberal senator from Oregon, fighting the oil company. So there have been a great number of memorable moments with filibusters, including Huey Long in the 30s discussing how to make oysters and pot liquor. The filibuster has a very colorful history, but the filibuster has evolved into something quite different in recent years, and I'm sure that we're going to hear a great deal about that from both Richard Arenberg, who has written a book about it, and Erwin Chemerinsky, who with his wife, Catherine Fisk, also a distinguished legal scholar, wrote a lengthy, comprehensive law review article about this during the Clinton administration. So, Richard, I want to start with you. Since your book is, entitled "Defending the Filibuster, Soul of the Senate," tell us why the filibuster is the soul of the Senate.
Well, thank you for having me this evening. In the discussion raging about the filibuster, often forgotten or simply dismissed is the role that extended debate and unfettered amendments has played in giving voice to minorities and protecting the moderating role of the Senate. The disease which is ailing the modern Senate is that the parties are so polarized that they're unable or unwilling to come to the table and negotiate. Abolishing the filibuster won't eliminate that problem, it'll exacerbate it. Now, the discussion is happening now for a very simple reason. Democrats believe that their agenda can only be accomplished if the filibuster is eliminated. In the end, it's really about seizing power. Actually, Joe Biden, when he was still a senator in 2005, said it quite well. At the time, the Democrats were filibustering and blocking 10 of the circuit court judges appointed by George W. Bush. Biden went to the floor and said, this nuclear option is ultimately an example of the arrogance of power. It's a fundamental power grab by the majority party. He went on to say, it's the ultimate act of unfairness to alter the unique responsibility of the Senate. At its core, the filibuster is not about stopping a nominee or a bill. It's about compromise and moderation. Finally, he said, I pray to God when the Democrats take back control, we don't make the same kind of naked power grab that you're doing.
So I want to ask you one quick follow-up question to that.
Sure.
Our image of the filibuster is, as described, I mean, in popular culture, you know, from movies and other things, is people taking the floor, standing up for a long time, waging a lengthy fight for whatever particular reason on a bevy of causes. But now the filibuster has evolved into something different, hasn't it, Richard?
Well, I think it has, but it's interesting that, you know, one of the reforms that people talk about is, you know, referring back to Jimmy Stewart, they refer to it as the talking filibuster. And the idea is to require those who are obstructing to stand up and defend their position. And in fact, that doesn't require a reform. And in fact, I agree with it. Former Senator Carl Levin and I wrote an op-ed piece recently in the Wall Street Journal, arguing that that's precisely what Majority Leader Schumer should be doing right now, is well, it needs to be said that so far that nobody's filibustered anything, but we all expect it to happen. And when it does, we argued that what Majority Leader Schumer should do is, you know, go into overnight sessions, press on for a week or two if he needs to, and if all of these proposals in the Biden agenda, which I support, by the way, are as popular as we say they are, we ought to be able to generate a considerable amount of pressure on the obstructing Republicans.
So, Erwin, I'd like you to pick up from there. I just want to add one thing. In addition to the op-ed that Professor Arenberg just cited that he did with former Senator Levin, Jennifer Rubin had an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday saying that basically the Democrats should embarrass the Republicans by forcing them to filibuster on the January 6th commission. What do you think about that?
Sure. Let me try to go step by step. First, let me explain why I think the filibuster is unconstitutional, undemocratic, and undesirable. First, it's unconstitutional. The Constitution specifies when more than a majority is required to do something. It says, for example, it takes 2/3 of the Senate to approve a treaty, or 2/3 of the Senate to convict the president and remove. Where it doesn't say that, the clear assumption is majority vote. The filibuster requires now, under Senate rules, 60 votes to pass something. I think that's inconsistent with Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. Second, it's terribly undemocratic. The Senate is always undemocratic, with each state having 2 senators regardless of size. Right now, the 50 Democratic senators represent 42 million more people than the 50 Republican senators. But the filibuster allows a minority to have tremendous effect in blocking legislation. Now, senators representing less than 25% of the population can block legislation. That can't be reconciled with any definition of democracy. And third, it's undesirable. Henry, I think you minimize the extent to which the filibuster was used to block civil rights legislation, not just in the 1950s, but for decades. Or take the American Rescue Plan that was adopted in January. Every Republican voted against it, even though the American people were overwhelmingly in favor of it. It only was able to be adopted because it was called a reconciliation measure and wasn't subject to a filibuster. Think now of the proposed legislation with regard to voting reform or police reform or infrastructure reform. None of them will be adopted because of the filibuster. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was how the filibuster changed. From 1917 to 1975, there was the talking filibuster, and it required that somebody hold the floor of the Senate. It required that those who wanted to stay in the filibuster be there in case there was a cloture vote. So as to keep the filibuster from shutting down the Senate, in 1975, it was changed so that all that has to be done is the minority party is say, we want a filibuster, and then the Senate goes on with all of its business. So effectively to adopt any legislation in the Senate takes 60 votes. And that's what I think is unconstitutional and undemocratic and undesirable. Finally, Professor Arenberg says we should have extended debate. There's many ways of extended debate without the filibuster. You could say the first vote takes 60 in order to be able to end debate. Then the next vote takes 55, and then the next takes a simple majority. You can have extended debate in that way. The problem with the filibuster is not just about extended debate. It gives the minority the ability to permanently block legislation.
I should say, just to pick up one thing, I neglected one thing in my initial remarks, which were that on 5 separate occasions in the 1930s and 1940s, that there were filibusters that successfully defeated anti-lynching legislation in the United States, during which one time, led by a number of Southern senators, including Theodore Bilbo, who said it was necessary to preserve Anglo-Saxon civilization. So let me be clear that that's on the record. And in fact, the United States Senate, where the Congress has never passed an anti-lynching bill. Most recently, Senator Paul has gotten in the way of it. Richard, you want to make some initial responses to Erwin's comments?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I want to be clear about one thing, and that is that I consider the use of the filibuster to fight civil rights legislation, as was done in the 50s and 60s, to have been evil and immoral. And I believe it was an abuse of the filibuster. It's become popular in the debate recently to refer to the filibuster as a remnant of the Jim Crow period. Well, of course, it was used for evil purposes. That doesn't make it necessarily an evil rule. And in fact, in that same debate I mentioned before, when I quoted Joe Biden, a young senator by the name of Barack Obama said the American people want less partisanship in this town, but everyone in this chamber knows that if the majority chooses to end the filibuster, if they choose to change the rules and put an end to democratic debate, then the fighting, the bitterness, and the gridlock will only get worse. If the right of free and open debate is taken away from the minority party and the millions of Americans who asked the Senate minority to be their voice, I fear the partisan atmosphere in Washington will be poisoned to the point where no one will be able to agree on anything.
Well,
my question is, if the filibuster is a remnant of Jim Crow, now it was in 2005, and how could Senator Obama view it in that light?
Wait, before I go back to Erwin, let me ask you one follow-up question to that. An argument that's traditionally made on behalf of the filibuster, similar to the one that you just made, is that the threat of a filibuster leads to compromise, leads to some form of moderation or something like that. But can that be reconciled with the conduct of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who from both the start of the Obama administration and the start of the Biden administration, one time surreptitiously and this time publicly, said that his goal was to defeat everything that those administrations were trying to achieve?
Well, I do think that McConnell has abused the filibuster. I do support a number of reforms in the rule, which we can get into if you like. They don't lower the threshold from 60 votes, but they do make it more difficult and make it likely that there will be many fewer filibusters. But the moderation, often people focus entirely on the obstruction, and that's understandable. That's out in the light of day. But much of the impact of the filibuster on the Senate is that it's in the DNA. It's that senators all know that to get anything of significance done, you have to work across the aisle to some extent. The minority has some leverage. I worked for 34 years on Capitol Hill. I worked for 3 Democratic senators. Every one of them, anytime I brought them any kind of legislative proposal or amendment or anything I was proposing for them to offer, the very first question I would get back is, who's my Republican co-sponsor? Well, that question doesn't get asked in the majoritarian House. It gets asked in the Senate because there needs to be some cooperation with the minority to get significant things done.
Okay, thanks. Erwin, I gather you don't think that the filibuster leads to compromise and moderation.
It sure isn't today in the United States Senate, and hasn't in recent years. Context matters so much as we talk about this. Barack Obama's statements were made in 2005. The situation right now in 2021 is so very different. I was going to point to, just Henry did, how Senate Majority Leader McConnell has made clear, at the beginning of the Obama administration, he's going to block everything. In the words of Groucho Marx from Horse Feathers, whatever it is, he's against it. And as a result of that, would eliminating the filibuster make Senate more partisan? I don't know how the Senate can be more partisan than it is today. You say, what the filibuster does is require that people work across the aisle. Well, take the examples that I mentioned. The American Rescue Plan. Now, one Republican voted in favor of it, even though it was overwhelmingly favored by the American people. If the filibuster applied to it, it wouldn't have been adopted, even though it was such important legislation. We desperately need federal voting legislation. There is 0% chance of it being adopted so long as a filibuster. There's no way Democrats are going to be able to work with 10 Republicans across the aisle to get it. Police reform legislation. On the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd, it should be the occasion for adopting police reform legislation. No chance in the world it's going to be adopted so long as it's the filibuster. President Biden's infrastructure plan. I don't think there's a plan he could come up with that's going to get 10 Republicans to go along with it. So I think in order to have the government we need, we've got to be able to get rid of the filibuster. Now, you and I might be able to agree to a lot of reforms that would lessen the effect of the filibuster, but then all what we're doing is agreeing that the filibuster as it now works is undesirable and frustrating essential legislation.
So, Erwin, let me ask you a follow-up to that. One of the things that you said was that it was unconstitutional. And I know in your prior writing, one of the things that you've said was that a particular aspect of it that was unconstitutional was Rule 22, which is basically prohibiting the Senate from changing its own rules, which your position is that it entrenches bad policy. Do you see, and you mentioned Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. Could you talk a little bit more about that and about the potential, what you see as the viability of a constitutional challenge to the filibuster?
I want to separate 2 questions in what you ask. One is, does the filibuster violate the Constitution? And the second is, what's the viability of a likely constitutional challenge? In terms of the former question, I think the filibuster is unconstitutional for the reasons I said. I think that the Constitution assumes majority vote in the House and the Senate, except in the places, and there are several, where it specifies a supermajority is required. But in terms of the latter question, I don't think that a court will declare the filibuster unconstitutional. There's also a provision in the Constitution that each House can make the rules for its own proceedings. And when challenges have been brought, courts have said, this is just a political question, we're going to stay out of it. So there are all sorts of instances where things are unconstitutional, but the courts aren't willing to hear the challenges.
So since you've mentioned courts, one area where clearly you don't have to have a supermajority any longer in the Senate is on the confirmation of Supreme Court nominees. And I looked up the votes today, and if there had been, the ability to filibuster, I believe that Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Thomas would all have been blocked.
Well, except there was the filibuster at the time Clarence Thomas was being considered. 48 Democratic senators voted against him.
Right.
They could have, but didn't filibuster.
Right.
When Sam Alito was confirmed in 2006, there were 43 votes against him. The Democrats could have filibustered, but they didn't. The filibuster for Supreme Court nominations wasn't eliminated until 2017. Now, we can speculate as to why the filibuster wasn't used. Now, I wish it were possible to filibuster Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh. I think the one thing that we see from eliminating the filibuster is it didn't make the Senate more partisan. They got confirmed. But I don't think that that tells us anything about whether the filibuster is constitutional or desirable.
Okay, so let's talk about the possibility of reform for a second. Richard, you said there were several possibilities about the way it could be reformed in some way. So why don't you tell us about those and how you think it would work?
Right. Well, one of the first things that I would do, and I suggested this in the book, would be to make the motion to proceed to legislation non-debatable. Now, this is the procedural motion to take a matter up. Now, for most of the time I worked in the Senate, nobody would filibuster the motion to proceed because it was just a procedural step to get the bill on the floor, and then the bill could be filibustered if that's what the minority wanted to do. But in recent years, as part of this all-out polarized partisan warfare, it's become quite a regular thing to filibuster the motion to proceed. I don't think there's any value added to that, what I think is a superfluous opportunity to filibuster. So I would change that. I would change the wording in Rule 22 that presently requires 3/5 votes. That's where the 60 votes come from. 3/5 of the senators duly elected and sworn. So that's a hard number of 60, no matter how many who's voting.
Right.
I would change that language to 3/5 present and voting. This would do two things. It would, in some instances, might lower the threshold slightly from 60 to 59 or 58. But more importantly, it would require those opposing cloture, those wanting to continue the filibuster, to be present and vote on that. It's not required for them to do that now. It's really only the side that's trying to end the debate that has to carry the entire burden. The other thing I would do, and this goes to this question about the silent filibusters and the change that Mansfield made and so forth. Well, the rules were not changed. What was changed was the behavior of majority leaders with the cooperation of minority leaders. And it became the thing that majority leaders wanted to do when a filibuster came up, was push things aside and go on with other business. But there's nothing that requires him to do that. And so you could, in fact, have the talking filibuster, but also a big part of this is what are known in the Senate as holds. And these are often referred to as the silent filibuster. This is the opportunity for any senator to raise a hold, block a bill, keep it from coming to the floor simply by writing a letter to his leadership and saying, I want to put a hold on this. Now, it's not absolute. It doesn't necessarily go on forever, but it can go on for months and months. And what a hold is basically an indication that if forced to do it, the senator requesting the hold would filibuster this. He or she would not provide unanimous consent or would not allow it to go forward simply with a motion to proceed. Well, those holes exist nowhere in the Senate rules. They are, in fact, they grew out of an era of senatorial courtesy. It in many ways serves the purposes of the leadership to have that kind of early warning system. So although they complain about the holes all the time, they don't do anything to get rid of them.
Well, basically the other side seems to not call their bluff.
Right.
Is-
Well, right, because they want their holes adhered to as well. I mean, this is a bipartisan thing, as much of this really is. I mean, you know, Nelson Mandela said, where you stand depends on where you sit.
Right.
And when you want to talk about the filibuster, it's a lot like that. As the gavel switches from one side of the aisle to the other, so does the position on the filibuster. Just one word about constitutionality, because I have great respect for Dean Chemerinsky. I don't want to, I'm not a constitutional scholar. It's with great trepidation that I debate this point with him, but I can read the English language. And Article 1, Section 5 gives the right to write its own rules to the Senate and to the House. And that provision would have no meaning if it didn't refer to something as fundamental as the terms of debate.
Just before I go back to Erwin, I want to just mention to the audience that several years ago, Senator Merkley from Oregon, a Democrat, proposed that there be basically a forced, what I call it, an actual talking filibuster, and his bill was defeated 49 to 46. And one of the things, I guess the way I would put it about the current situation from what it was, is that people can sort of, as you're sort of alluding to, can kind of free ride. They can sort of put this threat out there. But in the old days, I mean, whatever I thought of Strom Thurmond, and I can say my opinion of him is about as low as it can get, he at least stood up and did something. Now, most of these people, they don't even have to do anything. It's just kind of a free ride to stop something. So let's go back to Erwin on constitutionality and the viability of some of these reforms.
Sure. Let me start with the reforms. I agree with every reform that Richard described. And I want to emphasize what you just said, Henry. It used to be that the talking filibuster froze the work of the Senate, and that limited how often filibusters occurred. Now, once senators indicate that they're going to filibuster, the Senate goes on with its other work, and it takes 60 votes to pass legislation. I think changing that would be important, but I don't think Richard's reforms go far enough. If we're in the realm of reform rather than elimination, I'll go back to something I suggested earlier. Why not have the first vote takes 60 votes for cloture, then the second vote takes 55 for cloture, and the third takes 50 votes for cloture. You then have the extended debate Richard wanted, but you don't have the permanent ability of the minority to block what the majority wants. In terms of constitutionality, Richard points to the provision that says that each house can make the rules for its own proceedings. But clearly those rules can't violate other constitutional provisions. If a house made a rule saying no African American member can speak on the floor of this house, that would clearly be declared unconstitutional for denying equal protection. In fact, when the House tried to refuse to seat a member, Adam Clayton Powell, saying we get to make our own rules, the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. So any rules must be consistent with the rest of the Constitution. And the rest of the Constitution, I think, makes clear when supermajority votes are allowed, required, and it doesn't have supermajority votes for passing legislation. And that doesn't mean that the ability to make rules becomes irrelevant. If you read the rules of the House or the Senate, there are countless provisions that have nothing to do with that. All it says is all rules must be consistent with the Constitution. And I believe the rules that create the filibuster aren't consistent with the Constitution.
And there are exceptions. You can't filibuster the budget, as far as I can tell. So there are some exceptions to that. Richard?
Well, if we accepted the dean's formulation, the Budget Act is unconstitutional as well, because it imposes all of these 60 vote points of order on the appropriations process. And here's the heart of the problem. The dean listed all of these pieces of progressive legislation that McConnell is presumed to want to block, and says, well, Biden won't be able to get them done if the filibuster still exists. Well, with all due respect, I think that's a very short-sighted view, because if there's one thing, there's very little we can say with great authority about the Senate going forward. But one thing we can say is that it won't be in the hands of the same party forever. And this means that as soon as 4 years from now, Democrats may be faced with a Republican president and a Republican Congress and no filibuster, and the ability, and picture Donald Trump back in the Oval Office, no opportunity to affect, he would have complete control over the federal budget.
Richard, you make an important assumption there. You assume that the Republicans, when they have the Senate and the White House, won't eliminate the filibuster if Democrats are using to block their legislation. I think given how partisan the Senate has become, if there is a Republican president, a Republican Senate, they will eliminate the filibuster even if the Democrats don't. In 2017, when the Democrats filibustered Neil Gorsuch, the Republicans eliminated for Supreme Court nominees. Before that, the Democrats eliminated for lower federal court judges in the cabinet. I think the filibuster is going to be eliminated at some point. I think the question is, are the Democrats going to give up their legislative agenda and wait for the Republicans to eliminate the filibuster, adopt theirs? Or should the Democrats do what they need to do now to get these essential laws adopted?
So Erwin, let me just ask you a follow-up to that. A number of people, or let's just say some people in the, I guess I'll just say in the Democratic Party realm, and I'll include Richard in this, one of the primary arguments that I've been reading about in the last several months are the what if questions. The sort of what will happen if, so I take it that you think that that's an ill-founded notion because you think something that it's going to change however, and something good has to be done now.
I think the Republicans will eliminate the filibuster when there's a Republican president and a Republican Senate if the Democrats are blocking key legislative efforts. I don't think the Democrats are giving up something now by eliminating the filibuster. I've heard some say that it was the Democrats eliminating the filibuster for lower federal court judges that caused the Republicans to eliminate the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. I think that's nonsense. I think even if the filibuster had still existed for lower federal court judges, as soon as the Democrats used it to block Neil Gorsuch, the Republicans were going to change the rule to eliminate the filibuster. The Republicans have been threatening to do that, the so-called nuclear option, for years, and the Democrats caved earlier. I see too much unilateral disarmament by the Democrats in not using the tools they have, and then the Republicans use those same tools to their advantage.
Before I go back to Richard, let me just ask Erwin one more follow-up question, and that's this. It seems that the assumptions of why the filibuster was viable was sort of based on certain notions of how the Senate operated. Is it your view that those notions are now not only outmoded, but wrong?
At this moment in time, I'd say yes. I think Richard articulates a wonderful romantic notion that the filibuster will cause senators from the two parties to work together. We just don't see that anymore. I don't know if people have read Barack Obama's first volume of his story about being in the White House. And he talks about how he tried to work for years to get bipartisan support on things, but then ultimately discovered it's just not possible at this moment in time. And I think where we are now, if we want to have essential legislation like the relief bill that was adopted earlier this year, like voting reform, like police reform, like infrastructure reform, and so much. Either we eliminate the filibuster or change the rules dramatically, or that legislation is not going to happen.
Okay, Richard?
Let me address very quickly. You know, many of my Democratic friends use that argument that if the Democrats don't do it, the Republicans will. And they've been making that argument for quite a while. And in fact, what I would point to is Donald Trump was in the White House. He was elected in 2016, in 2017, in 2018. He had a majority in both houses. He repeatedly demanded that the Republicans eliminate the filibuster. It's about the only thing they denied him in 4 years in office. They fell into line on just about everything else, but McConnell said no.
But that's also because no major Trump legislation got blocked by the filibuster. Take, for example, the border wall, which Trump really wanted. He couldn't get a majority in the House. He couldn't get a majority in the Senate. It wasn't a matter of the filibuster that was blocking him. I think if Trump's major legislative efforts had been blocked by a filibuster, the Republicans would have eliminated the filibuster.
Richard?
I think if they had eliminated the filibuster, you would have seen a much more robust list of demanded legislation from the Trump White House.
Richard, I want to jump back, keep on with you for a moment with a question that came in from a member of the audience, which is a sort of a broadly philosophical question, but a pointed question nonetheless. And a member of the audience asked, why is a parliamentary rule more important than the undemocratic implications of a small minority blocking the will of the majority?
Well, you know, the numbers game is very interesting. You know, I mean, the real problem that a lot of people have really is with the Great Compromise. But you know, but just there are all sorts of interesting things you can do with numbers. If you want to take a look at if you eliminate the filibuster, a legislation could, in theory, it wouldn't ever happen this way, but in theory, could pass with a simple majority representing only slightly more than 4% of the American population.
Right. Right.
It ignores the House of Representatives, because the legislation would also have to pass the House, which is apportioned by population. I think that it's important to distinguish what's necessary to pass something as opposed to what can block something. To pass something, you got to go through both the House and the Senate. But to block something, just the Senate can stop that, and just the filibuster in the Senate can block legislation. And that's why senators representing less than 25% of the population can block something, but you'd still need a majority of the House to pass it.
And Richard, or when one of the things that seems to be kind of pivotal now are two Democratic senators who have expressed reservations, I guess that would be a polite way of putting it, of doing something about the filibuster, I guess, because of where they are and what they think, how they think their constituents will react. And that's Senator Manchin and of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona regarding the filibuster and the January the 6th Commission. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not sure I quite understood what you were asking, other than, you know, it's clear that in the instance of, by the way, of a lot of these things we're talking about, that we're listing that are part of the Biden agenda, for many of them, the 50 votes don't exist yet. I mean, that's just the reality of what's going on in the Senate. I mean, I think that's unfortunate, but Manchin and Sinema have openly opposed eliminating the filibuster. There are, I can tell you, a number of other members of the Democratic caucus who very much would like not to do this. It doesn't mean they won't vote to do it. I think it's pretty clear that the president himself would not particularly like to do this. When I finished my book, Defending the Filibuster, I got a handwritten note from Joe Biden, who was then vice president, saying this book should be required reading for every member of the Senate.
Erwin?
You say, of course, is right in terms of these two senators ultimately are determinative as to whether the filibuster to be changed or eliminated, as they are with regard to all legislation right now. I want to pick one example that I keep mentioning, and that's the voting rights bill. As we watch the laws being adopted in Georgia, Florida, and other states, it becomes so key that there be federal voting rights legislation. In 2013, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional crucial provisions of the Voting Rights Act. It's essential that Congress restore that procedure, the so-called preclearance procedure. My hope is that maybe the two senators that you mentioned in the Senate might agree to an exception to the filibuster for legislation that exists to protect the democratic process. Because otherwise I worry that this legislation adopted in Georgia and Florida and elsewhere is going to disenfranchise minority voters and undermine our democratic process. It's so essential it be passed, and it's not going to be passed unless an exception is created to the filibuster for it.
Let me raise an interesting question about what's happening in those state legislatures around the country that you're citing. Just to point out that if they had a filibuster, then the minority would be able to block these undemocratic rules that they're passing. And the problem with the fixing it at the federal level, although I'm, as I've said, totally in favor of doing that, it's where the short-sightedness comes in. When the Republicans come back in, they'll have the opportunity to federalize all of the interesting things they're doing with the vote in these various state legislatures.
But if they want to do that, they're going to be able to do that anyway. I don't think the Democrats foregoing voting rights legislation now is going to make it less likely that the Republicans will adopt bad legislation if they come back into power. And that's why it's
They'll
so
have the
essential
filibuster.
that, again, I believe that the Republicans would eliminate the filibuster as soon as they need to get a legislation they want adopted. But I think what's key is the Democrats have an essential need to adopt voting rights legislation, and it needs to be done now. And it's not going to be so long as the filibuster exists. And Richard, one thing that neither you nor I can possibly deny is that so long as McConnell's in charge of the Senate, and so long as the filibuster, voting rights legislation has a 0% chance of passing.
Richard, you don't debate that, do you?
It depends on how you define voting rights legislation. There may be a subset, there may be a portion of that bill which is acceptable to both parties.
Well, there's two.
I'm not saying that that's necessarily adequate, but I mean that, you know, that when the Senate's working, that's how we legislate.
Right, but at the moment, there's sort of two major bills, and one of them is a more tailored bill around pre-clearance, which would deal with what happened in Shelby versus Holder in 2013. That's the one that Erwin just raised. I mean, what do you think about the notion of an exception on that piece of legislation?
Well, you know, I personally would not be opposed to a narrow exception like that. What I worry about is that it's a terribly slippery slope. It might be very difficult to adequately define, and we would be dumping another enormous bundle of problems into the lap of the poor Senate parliamentarian who has had this happen to her with reconciliation. It would be the Senate parliamentarian who would be, you know, have to make the call on whether this was, you know, legitimately voting rights or civil rights or whatever the carve out is that you've designed. So if it could be adequate, clearly and adequately designed, then you know, I could see. I mean, the Senate has agreed to expedited procedures on a number of different sorts of topics.
Well, there certainly are instances historically where the Senate has threaded the needle on things, and there are also, and it certainly would be, this is not the only time that they faced a difficult challenge. Erwin, you want to add something on the design here?
Sure. I'm always skeptical of slippery slope arguments. In fact, eliminating the filibuster for judicial nominations hasn't led to the slippery slope of eliminating it for legislation, though I wish it would. I think there are instances where it is so essential that Congress act and Congress act now that at the very least there should be exceptions to the filibuster for that. And I put voting in that category. And I keep going back to the American Rescue Plan, and that not one Republican in Congress voted in favor of it. If the filibuster had been available for that, then it would have never been adopted. And we would have needed to create an exception to the filibuster there too.
Right. As a theoretical matter, I just want to check in with you on both. It is theoretically possible to eliminate the filibuster and then to bring it back, right? I mean, depending on who was in power, right?
Yes, yes.
Right.
Although in reality, I believe it's a one-way valve.
And what do you mean by that?
I mean, there's no going back, because majorities do what majorities do, and that is take power.
So in other words, you're saying if one party had the power and they eliminated it, then the other party would not reverse it because they would seize upon what there was.
The control over the House of Representatives has gotten tighter and tighter. We hardly ever have open rules any longer. Often legislation is not subject to amendment on the floor. So ask yourself how long it's going to be before Nancy Pelosi gets on the phone and calls Kevin McCarthy and says, you know, I don't think we're being very fair to you. We want to give you back a few more rights in the House of Representatives. It's not going to happen, and it wouldn't happen once the filibuster was gone in the Senate.
So I take it your view is abolition is bad, but and you're talking about reforms, would they be formal amendments to what there is now?
Well, my preferred way, I've been proposing this for years, and for some reason they just don't seize on my proposals. And that is that the leaders, particularly at a time like now, ideal time, it's 50-50. Nobody knows who's going to be the majority, who's going to be the minority in the next Congress. Let's put together a bipartisan select committee to reform the Senate rules. This would put them now in a position where no one knows, who to defend, the minority or the majority. Sort of deals with the Mandela problem that I spoke of before. It reminds me of what as a parent, I used to do when my kids were going to fight over a cookie. And that is, you say to one, okay, you divide the cookie in half, and to the other, you get to decide which half you want. And what you wind up with is the most exquisitely drawn division of a cookie that you've ever seen.
Solomonic. Solomonic, that seems to be more Solomonic than most of what's going on in the Senate these days. Erwin?
The philosopher John Rawls referred to that as the veil of ignorance, that if people made the rules without knowing whether they'd be in power, we'd be much better off. I certainly would agree with that. But I think what's important for the audience to recognize is that, Richard, you and I agree there's a serious problem with the filibuster today. We both believe that there's essential reforms that are needed. The only question is, how far should those reforms go? And I would just eliminate the filibuster. But I think everyone should realize that we are in complete agreement that what exists today in Washington, the Senate, isn't working.
Richard, it sounds like you agree at least on the problem, if not the solution.
Yeah. Well, it may sound a little Pollyanna-ish, if that's a word, but a lot of it boils down in the end to bad behavior. by senators. When I first served in the Senate, senators of both parties had a terrific sense of restraint when it came to applying the rules. And it's not just the filibuster. I mean, majority leaders are overusing the filling of the amendment tree, use of Rule 14 to circumvent committees. I mean, we can go through a long list. We're in an era of polarization now where majorities, I mean, where parties try to do whatever it is they can get away with. But that sense of restraint, that sense of responsibility, that sense of respect for the Senate that senators had, they didn't want to overuse the filibuster because they were deathly afraid that they would lose it.
Right, but that's clearly gone now, isn't it? And when you think about, what the Senate, I mean, I would just pose the question of, I think it's in your book or in one of the other books I read, that Dan Quayle talked about how his behavior changed when he got to the Senate because the House where he'd been was hyper partisan, and that the Senate wasn't so partisan. But clearly now it's just as it is just as partisan. And I just have to ask you one question about this idea of a commission. When members of the U.S. Senate say that what happened on January 6th was like a group of tourists visiting the U.S. Capitol, how could one expect them to come to a conclusion that was at all reasonable about a problem this knotty?
Right. Well, I would just say, for senators who have their heads so deeply buried in the sand, I don't think we're going to save the situation with or without the filibuster. I just think, I mean, this is the problem, is that this complete unwillingness to come to the table and seek some common ground. To me, that's the heart of the disease that we now face, and that giving the majority the keys to the bulldozer isn't going to solve that problem. It's going to exacerbate it, and it's going to further damage democracy.
Okay, I will treat that as your closing statement because it was a broad statement. And Erwin,
Sure.
You can give us a closing statement of a couple minutes now.
Sure. Richard, I think you're doing is looking back to a time when the Senate functioned differently. And the filibuster was part of that. But things have changed so dramatically. I think of the way Senator McConnell blocked Merrick Garland from even being considered, saying we should leave it for the next president after the election, and then rush through Amy Coney Barrett. There's no longer good faith in the Senate. And the question is, what should be the rules for now in order to be able to adopt crucial legislation? And Henry, I would go back to what I said earlier. This filibuster is unconstitutional. The Constitution does specify where supermajority is required, and it's not for all legislation. Now it takes 60 votes to adopt any legislation, with rare exceptions like budget reconciliation matters. Second, I don't think that this discussion is disputed that the filibuster is terribly undemocratic, that senators representing less than 25% of the population can block any legislation. And third, it's undesirable. I've gone through several examples of essential legislation that just isn't going to be possible so long as the filibuster. I don't think eliminating the filibuster is going to make anything worse. I think the Republicans will do it anyway. And I think to not eliminate the filibuster is going to mean that Joe Biden's going to accomplish very little as president.
I would like to thank both of you for a spirited discussion on a very important topic. And I'm now going to turn the program over to Larry Mantle for the discussion about the Middle East with Dennis Ross. And thank you both again for giving us your thoughts.
What a great conversation, Henry. Thank you so much. I loved listening to that and hearing what what our guest said on this program tonight. It's wonderful to be back with you this week. It's an honor to be here for the Judge Community Advocates events that we do every week, America at a Crossroads. And as you probably know, this is an additional half hour in which Dennis Ross will be joining us. I should just tell you that there's terrible weather in the greater DC area, and the area where he's in has suffered a major blackout. So he will not be able to join us on his laptop. We have to count that his phone is going to be able to hold up during the course of the half hour as he joins us. Let me just quickly introduce Dennis Ross, Director of State Department Policy Planning during President George H.W. Bush's administration, also Special Middle East Coordinator and Envoy in President Clinton's administration. He helped the Israelis and Palestinians reach the 1995 interim agreement on the West Bank and Gaza Strip. He facilitated the Israel-Jordan peace treaty and also worked on talks between Syria and Israel, author of several books for which he's joined me on our radio program, including 2004's masterful The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace. Dennis, it's so good to talk with you again. We have much to talk about as we are early in this ceasefire after 11 days of conflict. Secretary of State Blinken just wrapped up his two-day Mideast mission, got hundreds of millions of dollars in pledges from Arab allies to help with the rebuilding of the damage in Gaza. But, you know, the deeper disputes, of course, continue. And I just, first of all, how do we even get started on some sort of a peace process given the deep division now?
Well, first of all, let me say that there has been divine intervention. The power just came back on.
Oh, wonderful.
So let me see if I can actually get on my computer.
Okay.
Well, let me. All right. Let me just start with your question.
It's that we can see you well, so why don't we go as long as your phone holds
All right,
out, if
fine.
that's okay.
That's fine. Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm still feeling the glow of the miraculous restitution of or having power again. And actually, I'm watching an amazing light show here. The character of the lightning is unbelievable. Okay, so in answer to your question, how do we get back? I think we have to work along three separate tracks. Track number one is you got to think about how you stabilize Gaza. And the way you stabilize Gaza is by creating an equation of making it clear that there can be massive reconstruction of Gaza, but not if Hamas is going to be.
We lost you at the very beginning. You mentioned you can rebuild Gaza, but with Hamas, and then we lost you.
All right, so let me explain it. So the key is this: you can't allow Hamas you can't allow Hamas to go ahead and divert materials the way it has in the past. And I want to, before I go on to, I'm going to explain three tracks. The first track, though, depends, as I said, on if you offer massive reconstruction for Gaza, but not in a way that Hamas can divert materials. And I want to give an example of how they did that from 2014 to today. In the mini war that took place in 2014, which was over 51 days, Hamas fired 4,500 rockets. By contrast, it fired 4,350 rockets in 10 days. They were able to build up from 2014 to 30,000 rockets. It's not just the increased number of rockets, greater range, greater payload, and all of that. If you bear with me, I'm about to try to get back onto my computer, which will be a little easier. Here we go. Now it's saying, now it's not recognizing the link. Okay, I'll just keep with this. So they did a massive, they were able to, even though there was something called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, they were able to rebuild tenfold their rockets. They built over 100 miles of tunnel networks in the 7 years. And I want you to think about what it means to build that. Gaza is seen as being completely impoverished, and that's because it is completely impoverished. Before this conflict, Gaza had 50% unemployment. 80% of the population in Gaza was receiving assistance from the UN of some form. So they need massive construction, massive investment. And in this 7-year period, what was Hamas doing? They were putting all the materials underground, diverting it. So this makes very clear, if we're going to reconstruct Gaza, which creates a certain stability because there's a stake not to blow it all up, then there has to be a mechanism that A, oversees all the material coming into Gaza. B, there's tracking devices, GPS devices that are put on the trucks that carry the materials. C, they're monitoring devices within the warehouses, and there's oversight of the end use. This is what the administration, when Tony Blinken was in Israel, and he announced we want to do reconstruction of Gaza, and he says we're going to have to do it in a way that Hamas doesn't benefit. So this requires, in the first instance, framing this publicly so the world sees, and Hamas is put on the defensive, that if it resists the effort to produce this kind of oversight mechanism, there will not be reconstruction. There can be subsistence, but not reconstruction. So track number one is to stabilize Gaza. That's the way to do it. Track number two, bolster the Palestinian Authority. After all, what Hamas was doing to try to the reason Hamas launched the rockets the reason they launched rockets was to deal with to seize the mantle of leadership of the Palestinians away from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Why? By showing, in response to what was going on in Jerusalem, that they could inflict pain on Israel as Israel inflicted pain on Palestinians, and they would show how they would stand up, and they were relevant as opposed to Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. So they were seizing this opportunity, even though they knew the cost of doing it would be very high for Palestinians. Their political aims were what were guiding them. So again, you have to raise the political cost to them by shining a spotlight if they're going to stand up and try to prevent this kind of rebuilding of Gaza. So
can I just interrupt to ask you about the Palestinian Authority, because given how little traction the PA seems to have among Palestinians now, any effort to try and bolster Mahmoud Abbas or the PA, isn't that going to be seen as inauthentic and not going to carry any sort of leverage with the Palestinian people?
It's a fair point. That's why I say bolster them. The way you have to bolster them is you're going to have to show that they begin to deliver on some things. Now, here I would say one of the important things for us to be thinking about is, just as there's some conditionality with Hamas, if you want reconstruction to take place in Gaza, then you have to go along with what is going to be an oversight mechanism to be sure no diversion of material. One of the things we have to do with the Palestinian Authority, one of the ways to bolster it is to make it clear, as part of the international effort, we're going to mobilize to ensure there's assistance for Palestinians. We'll do it for the West Bank too, but the condition here is reform, rule of law, end of corruption. Now, if the PA looks like it's responsive, this will deal with one of the sources of great grievance within the West Bank, the high level of corruption. If we suddenly have a PA that is going along with what is an international effort that builds infrastructure, that as a result improves the economy further. And by the way, the starting point, the baseline in the West Bank is dramatically higher than it is in Gaza. The GDP per capita in the West Bank is $2,500 to $3,000 a year versus $1,000 a year in Gaza. So if you're able to expand the scope of this, you're gonna have a better chance to basically produce the kind of responsiveness that you're raising questions about, which is legitimate. The ineffectiveness of the Palestinian Authority is what has produced alienation. Obviously, the cancellation of the elections added to the anger. But if it looks like the Palestinian Authority is effective with the international community, that will also build its credibility. So that's track two. Track three is we have to focus on how do we take advantage of the normalization process of the Arabs with Israel, the Arab states with Israel. Now here, I like to cite the model of the UAE. The UAE basically came to the Trump administration and said, we'll give you a peace, we'll give you a win. We'll give you the first peace treaty since 1994 with an Arab state in Israel. But the price is no Israeli annexation of the territory allotted to Israel under the Trump plan, and military equipment for our security, which we've been denied because we're not at peace with Israel. Now, you could take a variation of that model. You could go to the Saudis and you could say to the Saudis, right, look, we understand that you're not going to take one huge leap towards normalization, but how about taking a partial step? What people don't remember is in the 1990s, we had 5 Arab states who established liaison offices in Israel, not full diplomatic relations. It didn't include the Saudis. But what if we could get the Saudis, what if we laid out a menu of choices in which we said to the Saudis, you establish a commercial trade office in Tel Aviv, which, by the way, MBS has a huge interest in trying to tap into what Israel represents. There were, just so you know, before the normalization with the UAE, there were 500 Israeli companies operating in the Gulf. 500. They weren't operating, on their Israeli passports, but everybody knew they were Israelis. There is a desire to take advantage of what Israel has to offer. So what you could do in this case is take the model of what was done with the UAE. You have the Saudis offer a commercial trade office, and what they seek in return would be the Israelis stop building to the east of the security barrier. That means Israel doesn't build on 92%, they build only to the west of the barrier in what are known as the settlement blocks. Now, for the Saudis, this could be a big achievement because they would not produce 2 states, but they would ensure the possibility of being able to guarantee it later. For the Palestinians, stopping building in 92% wouldn't be everything they want, but it would be a tangible achievement from their standpoint. And would the Israelis for that? And I'll just say this, and then good, then go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, but what does Israel need to do as a part of that process? And does Israel need to take, in your view, a stronger rhetorical stance that a 2-state solution is supported and takes that into a more vocal policy? Is that something Israel should do?
So the way to do what I'm describing is to broker it. So basically, if you're the Saudis, you're going to want to be able to say, okay, we achieved something for the Palestinians, and it was a positive, not just a negative. Now, part of the negotiation, part of what, again, this won't happen by itself. The U.S. would have to broker it. The Saudis would want something from the Israelis that they could show they were doing towards the Palestinians. And that could involve 2 things: that Israel reaffirms publicly its commitment to a 2-state outcome, and it stops building to the east of the security barrier on 92% of the West Bank. It will want something from us, just like the UAE did. They're very concerned about their relationship with us. They want certain sets of security assurances. So this is a kind of 3-way arrangement. I would also basically say I would do all this in private first, and then I would go to the Palestinians and say, this is what we have lined up. I'd go to the Palestinian Authority. What are you going to do? This can't just be, you don't get just to receive. What are you going to do as well? There are a number of things they could do, not the least of which would be acknowledging the historic Jewish connection to the land, something they've not done.
And what do you think realistically the Biden administration is likely to do? What's your sense of the approach they're going to take? How much are they likely to engage?
I think they will. One of the consequences of the last 2 weeks was that it's very clear that if you're not engaged enough to manage this reality, then you're going to have these kinds of explosions that suck you in a way that goes way beyond what you intended, distracts you from your other priorities, presents you with fewer options and higher cost. So I think one of the lessons from this has been there will be a higher level engagement in the Middle East to manage. In answer to your questions, I think there's a natural instinct to pursue the first 2 tracks of what I've described. There is support for the normalization process. I'm not quite sure at this point they've really settled on how to do that. I'm suggesting a pathway to do it, where you go in, you broker, you lay out a menu of options. The way you really do this is you go to the Saudis and the Israelis quietly, you lay out a menu of options. You basically go back and forth and you broker what would be steps that each would take. And then you can also go to the Palestinians. Now that requires obviously someone at a high enough level who can do it, but someone who's not so visible that they can also do things discreetly. So maybe that means from a practical standpoint, maybe they need, they might need a special envoy. I think originally they didn't intend to do a special envoy, but they might need a special envoy.
Are you volunteering for the role?
You'll
be in Israel next week, right?
Yes, I will be in Israel next week. I would say that they certainly know who they can identify for themselves who they want to be the special envoy.
I wanted to ask you about a Fox News poll that came out this afternoon that, among other things, asked American voters about their attitudes toward Israel and Palestinians. And the poll showed, in answer to the question, do you favor or oppose the United States providing financial aid to the Israeli government for its military? 56% of registered voters polled favor the U.S. providing financial aid, military aid to Israel. Do you favor or oppose the U.S. selling weapons to the Israeli government? 51% favor, 44% opposed. And in the Middle East conflict, do you side more with the Israelis or more with the Palestinians? 59% of American voters side more with Israelis, 24% Palestinians, 10 neither, and 7 don't know. What's the significance of that snapshot of this moment in time of American sentiment?
Well, I think it should be a duality. On the one hand, it still shows a majority of Americans instinctively identify and associate more with Israel, and certainly see that we have a commitment to Israeli security and we should stand by Israel. So there's still a majority for that. But I also think those numbers are less than they would have been in the past. And obviously, I suspect if you were to break it down, Republican, Democrat, Independents, we would probably see that there's strong Republican support. I would say probably pretty strong independent support, and much more mixed support on the Democratic Party side. So I think it is a reminder, I would say, for us generally, to think hard about what is this narrative. Now, I'm struck very much by what in a sense, the kind of coverage of the last 2 weeks. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Israel withdrew from Gaza 100%, didn't put an embargo or quarantine on it for almost 2 years after it withdrew. Has taken, it withdrew from Gaza, didn't get land for peace, didn't get land for security. Looks like it got land for rockets. And that's a story that should be told. Now, that doesn't mean everything Israel does can be excused, or that its behaviors towards Jerusalem, I think, were very well thought through. I think, in fact, the events of the last couple of weeks in Jerusalem, in many ways, were misguided. But that doesn't justify 4,500 rockets being fired against Israeli cities from a territory that Israel withdrew from. If people want to see Israeli withdrawals, the answer isn't after you withdraw, you get rockets. By the way, think about the following. Israel has withdrawn from 2 territories unilaterally, Lebanon and Gaza. And in each case, they got Hezbollah and they got Hamas. One of the reasons the peace camp in Israel was killed was not only the Second Intifada, but because when there's been unilateral withdrawals, the consequence has not added to Israeli security, it's added to Israeli vulnerability, or at least a sense of vulnerability. So part of the answer, I think, is to tell the story of what's going on, which is not to excuse all Israeli behaviors, because there's plenty of Israeli behaviors that I, among others, will criticize.
I wanted to ask you about, related to this forthcoming Israeli Supreme Court decision that's expected on the eviction of the 4 Palestinian families in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. How should conflicting claims like this, where parties bring up different documentation of whose it was and who gave it to, how should that be resolved?
Look, I'm afraid that in a historic conflict, when you go to legalisms, that isn't going to be the answer. Are the Israelis technically right, legally right, as to who holds, who in fact has legal tender, who is able to show a deed? It's probably on the Jewish side. It's probably not on the Arab side. But there are two issues in Jerusalem that set off enormous emotional reactions and create a life of their own for Palestinians. By the way, it's not like moving the embassy. There was no reaction when we moved the American embassy because that didn't touch the two issues I'm about to identify. One is the holy sites, the religious holy sites, the Muslim holy sites, and the other is Palestinian presence and the fear of being removed. When you touch those two, you set in motion events that are very difficult to control. Israel, I wrote a piece in the LA Times where I said, Israel was technically right, but there's one thing to be right, but there's also something else to be wise. And I think what we saw was not necessarily wisdom. Now, oftentimes the Israeli Supreme Court has, at times when the Israeli government has been required to remove unauthorized outposts or settlements that have been built, the Supreme Court has said, okay, do it, but then they've given the Israeli government years before they had to do anything. Seems to me this may be one of those cases where the court could also once again decide there's a principle here, but its application could be deferred for a long period of time. I think that would be a sign of wisdom.
Let me ask you some questions that have come from members of our audience in the few minutes that we have remaining in our conversation. Let's see. Rob asks, how does Iran factor into all this?
Well, clearly Iran, tries to foment as much of as trouble as it can. The weapons that Hamas has, basically, the Iranians trained, first of all, they gave them rockets and then they trained them to build new ones. Drones that they sent during this conflict were provided by the Iranians. Even during the time of maximum pressure of the Trump administration, they were being squeezed financially. They were still giving Hamas money and resources. So they're obviously, in this case, they want to promote conflict. The last thing they want to do is see it end. There is an interesting angle, though, to your question, it seems to me, and the answer to it. Obviously, I think that President Biden built his credibility with the Israeli public because he stood by Israel during this conflict, resisted what were 3 Security Council resolutions, none of which, by the way, named Hamas. I mean, think about it. Security Council is an institution designed to preserve and promote international norms. There aren't many international norms that are more fundamental than not firing rockets against your neighbor. And yet you had drafts of Security Council resolutions that wanted to focus only on Israel. So I think the fact that Biden stood by the Israelis builds his credibility. Even though there's differences with Netanyahu on the issue of the JCPOA, I do think that there's probably more political slack there than would have been the case otherwise, because there's a sense that Biden really does recognize Israel's predicament and just demonstrated it. So this is an issue that's not going to go away, but I also think you're going to see a level of consultation that will be designed to try to manage this as much as possible.
Toby and David both asked the same question. They want to know what you think of Thomas Friedman's piece in the New York Times.
Well, I think there's a lot of merit to it, because I think what he's doing is he's calling attention to, everything that this conflict over the last 2 weeks revealed. One, it revealed that the Palestinian problem won't simply disappear. 2, it produced great intercommunal stress within Israel. 3, it produced obviously real dissonance here within the Jewish community. And so what I think Tom was trying to flag is that, you actually have to have some kind of an active approach to peace, where I agreed with everything in it except one thing, that the administration should start by presenting the Trump plan as its own. Let me say one thing about diplomacy. When you think about diplomacy, you're doing 2, I'll just say it this way, you reduce it to 2 items. Item number 1 is take away excuses. Take away excuses why someone can't do something. Item number 2 is give them an explanation. They're 2 sides of the same coin. if we come out and we support the Trump plan, you give the Palestinians an excuse that others in the region and internationally will accept as, well, that's not credible. We want to take away the PA's excuses. I mean, let me give you a little history here. The Palestinian Authority has never accepted any peace proposal that was made by the United States or any real international agent in the sense, any international proposal. So they rejected. I can tell you they rejected the Clinton parameters. They rejected what was Olmert's offer, which the Bush administration backed. Olmert's offer, by the way, just to put in perspective, would have given the Palestinians essentially 99.5% of all the territory. The Olmert plan was basically the Clinton parameters plus. So the Clinton parameters were turned down. The Olmert plan was turned down. Barack Obama presented a set of principles to Mahmoud Abbas on March 17th, 2014, that went beyond what had been agreed with the Israelis, was promised an answer, hasn't gotten an answer to this day. So the fact of the matter is, these are peace proposals that have been made. I think I want to put them in a position where we take away their excuses, don't give them excuses. And that means the proposal you make has to be seen as being credible. Now, the irony is the Trump plan actually could have been credible if they had had at least some serious discussions with Arab leaders. I'm not even talking about the Palestinians, because the Palestinians were boycotted. They didn't allow any serious input from Arab leaders, and they could have done that. And my guess is you could have come with something that was less than the Clinton parameters and more than what Trump offered.
There's some other excellent questions. We're getting short on time, but if I could impose on you for just some really quick answers to a couple of complicated questions, of course. Wendy asks, would Bibi Netanyahu no longer being prime minister, would that make a difference?
I'm not sure. I think a lot depends upon the kind of government that emerges. If you have a right-wing government, it'll be interesting to see what the potential for change is. The reason I raise this notion of public outreach from the Arabs is because that creates a political space, even for people on the right, to do something towards the Palestinians. If you try to focus exclusively on concessions Israel has to make to the Palestinians, but they don't see themselves getting anything from the Palestinians. If you focus on what they get from the Arabs, they can justify steps towards the Palestinians. That could affect, in my mind, any government. That's why I said 80% of the Israeli public supported the idea of normalization with the UAE, not annexation. That tells you that's where the political room for maneuver might be. When it's narrow bilateral between the Israelis and the Palestinians, there's just disbelief of what the Palestinians will deliver.
Donald asks, do you think Hamas can ever be moved away from violence and its commitment to destroy Israel?
Hamas as an organization will never move away from it because it's part of its credo. The question is, if you can create credibility about a genuine offer and there's progress being made and it looks like there's a real possibility, could you see the potential for a split within Hamas? There, I think there is a potential for a split, because Hamas is while it's a deeply ideological organization and the hardcore will never change, many have been drawn to it because of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. So if suddenly you're changing the character of the Palestinian Authority and you're offering something that's real, my suspicion is you may see some may leave Hamas, but Hamas as an organization won't change.
And final question from one of our viewers. Matthew asks, how serious is the fallout from the conduct of the Israeli Arab citizens in engaging in violence in recent weeks?
I think it's very serious. I think it was shocking. I think there'll be a lot of soul searching within Israel now. I hope that what we'll see is very serious outreach. I think there should be summits with all the mayors of Arab towns, cities, and villages. I think there needs to be a serious kind of intercommunal dialogue, both interfaith with religious leaders, but also there needs to be serious political outreach to leaders of the Arab community and especially the towns and cities, and a kind of recognition that something clearly went off the rails. There needs to be much more investment in the infrastructure of Arab towns and villages. There needs to be much more law and order. This is what, in fact, Mansour Abbas of the Ram Party was insisting on. This is what the Arab public was also focused on. Before this, we saw the vast majority, and I would still say this is true, the vast majority of Arab citizens of Israel wanted to be integrated into Israel. They wanted a piece of the pie. They wanted to be treated the way the predominantly Jewish cities were being treated. They wanted law and order. There was a high murder rate among Israeli Arabs, like 5-6 times what you see in the rest of Israeli cities. They wanted much more serious attention to that. So I think now is the time to, for serious outreach, and I hope and it'll be interesting to see, I'll just close with this thought. It'll be very interesting to see how will this affect, we're likely to see a fifth election. I don't think Lapid is going to be able to put together a government. He has one more week to do so. If he can't do it, the odds are we'll have an election probably the end of September. It'll be very interesting between now and then to see what is the political reaction to what's taken place, not just the war with Gaza, but more specifically, this extraordinary intercommunal strife, which, as I said, was appalling, came as a shock to most Israelis.
Dennis, thank you so much, particularly for spending the additional time because of the difficulty connecting up. We wish you the best despite the very dramatic storm that's there. Hopefully it's passing through. Thank you again for joining us for America at the Crossroads.
My pleasure. I was a little distracted to begin with, but glad we got it through.
That was a terrific presentation. Thank you so much. And I want to remind you that America at the Crossroads is back. The program on Thursday night next week, not its typical day. It will be Thursday evening, June 3rd, 5 o'clock Pacific time. Congressman Adam Kinzinger, KCRW's Madeline Brandt will be in conversation. The topic, a vision for reform of the Republican Party. From all of us at Judge and Community Advocates, Inc., and for all the participants in tonight's America at a Crossroads, we wish you a very good Wednesday evening. Look forward to seeing you next week.